Ever wonder where the word missionary came from? No, we're not referring to those who travel to promote their faith. We're talking about the sex position. Believe it or not, missionary was the only sex position allowed at a point in time, as it provided the least pleasure for a couple. But why would anyone want to promote that? It is sex we're talking about, something that is done with nothing but pleasure. Surprisingly, it was the theologians from the Middle Ages that said sex should only be done a certain way. You may be wondering, why on earth would they even need to dictate what sexual positions were allowed? The Middle Ages were definitely a different time, seemingly an entire different world, compared to today's liberal approach not just to sex, but even on marriage. Welcome to Intrigued Mind, and join us in unraveling sex and marriage during the Middle Ages. We're not any different to our grasp of the concept today. Well, let's take a look at it from 100 years ago. The Middle Ages was considered the medieval period or the Dark Ages in Europe. Occurring between the 5th century to the 14th century, this part of history was marked by the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Renaissance. Notable events during this time included the Black Plague, the Crusades, and the 100 Years' War. Figures that defined this time period were Joan of Arc and Charlemagne, known today as the Father of Europe. But even if we knew the significant parts and figures of medieval times, their customs are just as important to understand to get a grasp of what kind of society they lived in. Concerning customs like courtship and marriage, one would probably have an image in mind of medieval romance as seen in many of today's television series and books. However, was that truly the narrative in the early centuries? Was it all about chivalry or kings on white horses? Make no mistake, chivalry and romanticism with knights and troubadours would arrive at the latter part of the Middle Ages. But in the early period, it was more of a business ordeal, especially among the upper classes. Although love and sex were a part of the reasons to get married, this was more common among the lower classes. For the upper classes, it was an entirely different story. Courtship and marriage were institutions that were driven through negotiations between families. Parents among high-class families would talk amongst one another and make deals to increase their family's wealth. In fact, as early as childhood, sons and daughters were often considered as betrothed. Some did not even meet their future spouses until the marriage date. By then, the bride would usually be a teenager, and a groom would be in his early 20s. Most marriages did start off as somewhat of a business transaction. There would be rules on what one family or the other would do if the bride or groom died after the betrothal was made. In addition, there was the rule that when a father found a suitable husband for his daughter, he was to pay the groom's family a dowry in exchange for their taking her hand in marriage. Indeed, it was one way to get your child out of the house for good. But it did come with a hefty price, as a dowry could be anything from a farm animal to chests of gold, depending on the family status. This dowry was usually presented on the day of marriage. In the early Middle Ages, there were no church marriages. In fact, marriage was more for the upper class, but there was no priest involved yet. After a couple of centuries into the medieval period, the church would take over marriage as an institution and as a holy sacrament, which led to its practice as a ceremony presided over by a priest. A marriage would be celebrated by placing a notice on the door of a church, where it was written who was to be wed. And if anyone had any reason on why the two should not be wed, the wedding would be prohibited, much like the priest asks in weddings today. What were some of the reasons to stop a wedding? Well, consanguinity is one, rape was a valid reason, and both parties had to be a proper age, which was at least 12 to 14 years old. There were many rules to their idea of marriage, and if you think about it, It does not differ much on how we handle weddings aside from the higher age requirements for marriage and the millions of dollars spent on its celebrations. But what about sex before marriage? Was it a taboo practice? Surprisingly, it wasn't. Well, at least not at the start of the Middle Ages. There were other rules as to what dowry would be given if the couple had embraced, kissed, or even had sex before marriage. But just because one had sex in the Middle Ages did not mean that it was a done deal. In fact, it was common among arranged marriages for the bride and groom to sleep with each other for many years before the marriage date. Since the marriage process took years and transactions had to be made between families. Moreover, it would be years before you can finally share a bed. Might as well do it while you still can. But kidding aside, it wasn't even expected to have sex with your officiated spouse. It seems like the Middle Ages mirrored the usual dating game we have today. However, this changed when the Church took a firm monopoly on marriage as a legal institution. Before the Church went berserk on marriage and sex, priests and monks were allowed to have mistresses. But after the Church figured practices had to be changed, they were forbidden to marry or keep any concubines. All marriages had to be officiated by a priest and had to undergo consultation for reasons of marriage, much like how it is today. Sex, however, is a different topic altogether. It changed. A major scholar of the 12th century wrote that there were two things that were needed in a marriage for it to be binding: to love your partner and have sex. It was not long after when the Church took on the institution of intimacy. Sex before marriage started gaining taboo. It was stated that the only reason to have sex at the home was to produce heirs. Any other reason would have been sinful, including pleasure. Here we have a documented case of a French cleric confessing to the Inquisition that shows how the religious beliefs of people in the medieval period radically changed their views on their practices. The cleric said, "I was living in Toulouse and did it with a prostitute. After I had perpetrated this sin, my face began to swell. I was terrified and thought I had caught leprosy. I thereupon swore that I would never sleep with a woman again." The Church was pervasive in every aspect, including intimacy practices. There was even a handbook written in the early 13th century called the Samani Confessarium, which listed down the sexual activities between married couples and when they were not permitted to have sex, which included feast days and fast days, Sundays, and whenever a woman was unclean, such as during menstruation, breastfeeding, or 40 days after childbirth. If you think that is excessive, then you are going to think the Middle Ages were crazy times. Because aside from the wars and the plague, they even came up with a handbook for women. It was called the De Secretis Mulierum, which roughly translates to the secrets of women. It was written for the supposed purpose of understanding women and their supposed secrets, whatever they were. This was a popular text in the Middle Ages, as it advised men on how they should have intercourse. Excerpts from this book involves advising physical preparation, such as emptying the bladder, fondling the lower parts of the woman to raise her body temperature, and that when the wife starts to babble, that's the time he must make his move. What's surprising about this is that it was written by Albert Magnus, known as Saint Albert the Great. Truly a great saint for men. Pretty surprising how a religious figure, a saint nonetheless, influenced the sexual practices of men and helped with their dating game in the Middle Ages. But did the women know their men used this handbook? Well, yes, since it was a famous writing, but hopefully it didn't start a war of some sort eventually. But even if the Church, or even a saint for that matter, gave advice on how to have sex, it was still considered a sin to do it for reasons other than procreation. The medieval Church even imposed penance for it. The penance for masturbation, for example, was fasting. That could last from 30 days to as much as 2 years. This was just the bottom tier of the hierarchy of sexual sins. Higher tier sins were anal copulation, which gave us the term hellhole, as babies cannot be made that way. Certain sexual positions were also as sinful, but the worst sexual sin was oral sex. However, even if sex was a taboo topic, the medieval church turned a blind eye when it came to promiscuous business. Brothels or people working in the sex industry were seen as respectable professions. Perhaps it was seen by the church as an outlet for young and unmarried men to dissuade them from sodomy, which was a sin. No surprise there. Even if it was a sin, it certainly did nothing to discourage individuals' innate desires at the time. Which begs the question, how was sexual orientation tackled in the Middle Ages? In the Middle Ages, the term LGBT did not exist yet. In order to understand sexual orientation in this context, one is required to think about how medieval people understood sex and gender on their own terms. They mostly just catered based on chastity, whether one was a virgin or one who has had sex, or whether one was engaged in reproductive sex or non-reproductive sex, or sodomy. Nonetheless, the medieval category of sodomites existed was broader and more inclusive than the modern definition of homosexuality. Men who slept with men were criminalized. However, the punishment depended on which part of Europe you were in at the time. Prosecution and death penalty were the most common punishment. However, in medieval England, church fines were imposed instead. Nevertheless, men who were higher in status could get away with man-on-man action. A historical rumor has it that Richard I of England had a long secret affair with Philip II, the King of France. How scandalous! Even though many sexual acts were prohibited, was there any safety to those who did the deed? In terms of protecting relationships, adultery was punishable as it was considered a grave sin. In a historical account, French King Philip IV captured the lovers of his sons' wives and had them disemboweled. Common punishment for adulterous women was not death, but whipping, head shaving, and parading the adulteress through the streets. Shame! The husband can either take her back or leave his wife enclosed in a monastery. This also applies to a husband when he is the one caught cheating. Punishment was even noted to be far worse for them. Medieval times protected and punished its people for cheating. But do they protect their men and women in terms of sexual health? As a matter of fact, contraception did exist. Medieval men had condoms. Although they weren't made of the same material as we have today, they would be made out of animal guts. Women, on the other hand, had plants such as artemisia and juniper, which were known to inhibit fertility, much like pharmaceutical contraceptives today. Despite all ancient contraceptives, celibacy remained the best form of contraceptive. In the Middle Ages, it was highly valued as a spiritual virtue, as it was a rule among priests and nuns, though being a virgin was noted to come with risks as well. Numerous accounts from this time period look towards balancing the humors, which were bodily fluids that when unbalanced caused disease. In order to treat celibacy-related diseases, such as too much pent-up semen due to abstinence among crusaders, phlebotomy was done, which requires one to bleed to bring out balance in the humors. We discussed a lot about the concept of marriage and sex was in the Middle Ages. And the question is, was there any difference to our understanding and concepts today? Well, they are not as different from our customs today as we might have assumed. People could get married for love, have sex for fun, and family planning even existed. Although we do not see many places that hold arranged marriages and make sure a dowry is exchanged. What is essential is how far we have come with regards to human sexuality. Humanity has lived through a time where chastity was highly valued. Now we live in a time where a person is not defined by her sexual status or her sexual orientation, although not everywhere, and we have a long way to go for all-round inclusivity. But we still have time. As history has taught us, we will get there. For more videos on the amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel. Like the video and leave your suggestions in the comments below.